3 years ago, when organizations started talking about digital transformation, it was a buzzword. Organizations realized the potential of what digital could bring to them. However, there was very little clarity in terms of how to go about doing that. They recognized the need for capability building, but there was very little that they could do to actually go back and land it, and there were several challenges. Today, I can sort of assume very safely that most of you sitting in this room perhaps is involved in transformation of some kind that's digitally centered. So, which means we've come a long way from understanding what that concept was to trying to see what we could do to put that into practice. But there are several challenges that still remain, and those challenges have not gone away. Because the backbone of this transformation that we see today is built on technology. And technology is shifting so rapidly today. So 3 years ago, what did digital mean? If you had put together a definition in the context, it would have meant, perhaps in many contexts, irrespective of the industry you represented, it would have meant SMAC, which could have been social, mobility, analytics, cloud. Today, when you start looking at the technology elements that formulate digital, you would be intimidated with technologies such as humanized big data. You're talking about blockchain technologies. You're talking about artificial intelligence. You're talking about technologies that have become so rampant in the last 2 years that it's difficult to now keep pace with how do you take ownership of making sure that your capability can be built in those areas. So the first challenge that most organizations today face as we talk to industry leaders and captains, not just in India but across the globe, is understanding what are the technology elements to bet on and how do we really build capabilities around that. So that's a big challenge that most of you face today. The second issue that most of you face is also around the fact that if you understood the technology, how do you go back and implement a strategy that could actually result in capability building? Because talent is hard to get for those skills outside. You've got to build talent in a very quick way, and you also have to scale it across the organization. So that's a challenge to figure out how. And the third is today, especially for the Indian context, you've got to change the culture of how learning happens. So people can't be forced to learn because the organization mandate says that. People now have to be, I would say, incented to learn, and they have to be pointed to the right direction of figuring out what their competencies are and how do you build those competencies, which means learning needs to get a lot more personalized, and learning needs to be shifted, or the accountability needs to be shifted back to the employee rather than it being an organization mandate. Easier said than done because cultural shifts take a very, very long time, and it's complex to land to. So those are the three challenges. So what we're going to do is to hear from the panel today. So let's start with Selvan. Selvan, you've been in the industry for now almost 3 decades, and you've seen a number of transformations happen. You can also say that you've weathered many storms that have come and gone. How different is this phase of transformation? Do you see this as different from the past? Is it something which is just here to stay and go away? Or do you think that this is really different that organizations need to take more cognizance of? And second, how should organizations wire themselves differently as they start to look at this phase of digital transformation?
Right. As you said, the difference between other transformations and what we saw recently was the speed at which it happened. So it was, I would say, that some of us were not as prepared as we should have been for the speed of the change that happened. However, I think coming to the second part, how do you handle that? How did we really address it? I think I can share some perspectives on that. Of course, each of us would have done it in a different manner. Everyone is successful in their own way, but let me pick out something which is completely outside of technology and talk about this particular disruption. We learned something from society, from families, what happens when disruptions happen. So that's something very unique, I would say, what we did. So if there is something that happens all of a sudden in a family environment, then what we notice is that you suddenly find your relatives coming together, you suddenly find your friends coming together, rallying with you, and even neighbors come up and say that, look, don't worry too much about it, we are there to support you and tide over this sort of a crisis. So we said, why not use that as a strategy? And we said, what is behind all this? Behind all this is nothing but the feeling of connectedness. So when people come together from different walks of life and they are there to rally around a particular thing, it's all about connectedness. So we said, how do we in L&D create connectedness across different communities? within an organization. So you have the sales community, you have the architects community, you have software engineering community, you name it, everything is a community there. So the the strategy that we coined was called as mobilization, which is nothing but getting communities together around this point of disruption and saying, how do we really take this together and tide over it? It really proved very well for us because getting different communities together, discussing about the common area of concern, along with the customer sometimes, makes everyone understand it in the same way and say that, okay, we think we can come over it. So that's what we call as mobilization. The second interesting thing, if I can just take one more minute on this, is that when we looked at same society, we found that whenever there's a crisis, whenever there's some disruption, people go back to practicing rituals. So you will find that they become either very pious about something, they go to the temple more often. So you will see that they suddenly rediscover rituals. So from L&D perspective, what we did was, we also rediscovered rituals at Capgemini. So we found out what was there tying us for the last 50 years as an organization. Those are the fundamental rituals, and we have lost it as part of this disruption, chaos that was happening, people were just moving all over the place. We had forgotten those rituals. So we call that theme as winning behaviors. So winning behaviors in Capgemini is nothing but a set of rituals which we reinvented or rediscovered, I would say, started practicing to tide over this particular area. So two things, just to summarize as a strategy, how we overcame this particular transformation was, how do we get connected and how do we rediscover our rituals as an organization. A ritual can be like if you do a delivery to a customer, what are the things that you do as a team? If you have a birthday, what do you do as a team? If you have, let's say, a sales win, what do you do as a team? Those were the rituals which we had forgotten. We rediscovered all those rituals and called it as winning behaviors. So in essence, those are the two things which I would say as strategies for us.
Just to add a caveat, the three panelists here are representing their own views. They're not representing the views of their organization. So as they talk about their experiences, they really giving us their recommendation, their insights in terms of how should we go about doing this. Sachin, rediscovering rituals, from what Selvan talked about. I think one key element that we also need to look at is from a perspective of the changes we are seeing. While we rediscover these rituals, one of the key challenges is that roles are no longer the same within organizations, right? With the disruptions that we're seeing more and more newer roles coming in. Roles are getting consolidated. They're becoming more comprehensive. I mean, we're starting to talk about full stack development as a concept, which essentially means that every person would need to learn at least 3 or 4 new skills, maybe 5 or 6 new technologies. It's been very difficult to even get people to learn a new skill in a year. But this is the pace at which we need to now accelerate in order to learn about 3 or 4 new skills. So how should organizations go about doing that? What's been your experience in this kind of a disruptive mode, rediscovering rituals, but still making sure that people are able to learn a lot more than what they're doing while doing the organization and capability transformation?
One of the things that I realized is happening in the space of learning is people who are actually making decisions around learning are people who are not the learners. And they don't think like the learners. We are effectively shortchanging ourselves, our organizations, and our learners if we believe that they don't have the capability of doing more or as much as we expect them to do. Yes, to your point, roles are evolving and roles are changing. Couple of areas of differentiation that I'm seeing personally. Roles are effectively becoming more invisible. The performance part of the role effectively is becoming more inside the cranium than outside. That's one important thing. Roles are also becoming more compound, which means that they're effectively leveraging skills and capabilities in a very different ways that we haven't really seen before. And this really creates a challenge for traditional learning teams in terms of figuring out how exactly is the role getting performed. The complexity of organizations is also creating this whole challenge of not really knowing what really causes a particular role to be successful. The capability, yes, but are there other elements of success? And how can we then go ahead and recreate those elements? That's one way of thinking about roles. Responding to that, I think, is, a couple of ways that I've kind of, I've seen happen around me and probably participated in it. I think one is to empower the learner. I don't know how many of you have a mandatory learning requirement in your organization. But my personal perspective is that has to go. There is no way, when you force people to go ahead and do something that you want, they will do it perhaps at a very cosmetic level, and it'll never be really meaningful. The second is to give them some sense of direction, some sense of where they can go. Typically, we've used competencies in our respective organizations, and I'm sure I'm speaking for a lot of people here. When you ask people about competencies, a lot of people say, yes, we have it, but we don't use it. We're not using it completely, or we're not even using it partially. Competencies were created and developed from a point of view of performance appraisals and performance measurement. I think we need to go ahead and change that lens and create it from or at least project it and message it from a point of view of, this is where you can go from a learner's perspective. I think that's the second way of doing it. And the third thing is to actually go ahead and let the learner, kind of go out of this organizational learning cage that we are creating. Our LMS, our content, our thought process. The new world, none of our organizations are effectively at that bleeding edge of technology, where technology really is. That bleeding edge from a technology standpoint, and I'm sure you would agree with this, is in GitHub, is not within the organization. So I think it's important to kind of, let people go ahead and access and learn the way they want to learn, rather than us looking at, forcing them to learn the way we want to learn.
Great, thank you. So empowering the learners and making sure that you give them the freedom of choice so that they're able to learn those competencies that you're recommending from them. Dhamayanthi, the point that Sachin made about looking at empowering the learner and also looking at the competency frameworks. The challenge today in the digital world is that the competency frameworks don't exist. So you've almost got to become entrepreneurial in execution, because your business is going to need resources as quickly as the demand is identified. You don't have the time to train them in a conventional way. And you've got to make sure that the resources can be deployable, which means they also need to prove their skills before they can go into projects. Or whether it's a captive organization or it's an IT services organization. So from a perspective of run world-class execution, how would you approach skill building in the new world, especially when you're looking at speed and scale?
Arun mentioned about many awards I have won. One of the awards which is very close to my heart is the Gold Business Impact Award, which I have won in California, Chief Learning Officers. I was the only Indian woman. That was something which is very close to my heart. Are you not planning to clap? Thank you so much. I was waiting for this. Please clap for others also. Thank you so much. So I need to definitely thank People Matters, because at home, my family never listens. My husband at least pretends listening. My teenage kids have absolute clarity. Okay, so now here, room full of learning and development leaders, my own fraternity. I belong here, and you are all going to listen to what I am going to say. Thank you so much, People Matters. Over is here. Thank you so much. So coming to the question which Arun had asked, competency framework. Okay, all of us have got competency framework. I don't think there will be any organization which will not have the competency framework. But when we are talking about deploying people to the customer engagements, which customer will agree to the competency framework that we have in our organization? So he will always come back and say that this is what I want. I don't care what you have. I don't bother how you train, but I want people in this particular skill, this proficiency level. You may be calling as beginner, he will call as novice. Okay, so like that the terminology changes, and you need to talk their language. And like Arun was telling, it is all about that sense of urgency. Unless we have the sense of urgency with learning and development professionals like us, we will never be able to achieve what the customer wants. How do we do it? So there is no one way at all. Okay, sometimes if the customer is new and the engagement is totally new, you cannot train people and put for the customer engagement. They will throw them away because you will lose trust. Initially, the core team which you are planning to put, it has to be experienced people. So you can find, if you can find internally, rotate people within your organization and create the core team which can deliver what the customer expects and deliver beyond expectations, it is good. You build the trust. After that, you do whatever you want. You can train people, you hire people. So what we do, we hire people. The next thing what we do, we look for people with the base skills within the organization. If they have Java, shall we train them on Pega? If they have .NET, shall we train them on Scala? So whatever is the prerequisite, identify people. Randomly don't train people. Identify people with the prerequisite skills and learnability quotient and then train them. Then the next thing what you can also do is don't hire them with the final skill. Suppose you want Pega, don't hire them with Pega. Hire them with Java and then train them on 1 month on Pega and then deploy them. So that also works because you can save cost, and it's really important that you have to train them on what customer needs, not the people with the skills that they have. They may not clear the customer interview. Nowadays, the customer interview is critical. And I happened to be with one of the customer interview yesterday. He was actually doing hackathon. Imagine, he's not even interviewing people. He just called the group of people and then he gave a problem statement. And he was observing all through the day. And he was not 7 people from the customer engagement. All of them were observing how agile they are demonstrating, how the agile, the squad team, how they are coming together as a squad team, how they are coming up with breaking the problem statement into story points, how they are moving from starting here to actually deploying and what is there, how are they collaborating in deciding the technology. All these are like they are observing, and then they want in 4 hours, 5 hours, the final outcome, not necessarily the final output which they can deploy, but at least the approach they are testing and the prototype has to be developed very quickly. So all this, imagine how can I train people in the normal way and assume that they will clear in the hackathon. So these are some of the things that we need to really understand. It is no one way. It is like you will have to understand the customer expectation and accordingly train people and talk the business language to the customer. So that is very, very critical.
That's great. So creating a core team, Sachin, from a point of view of culture, if you have to create a core team, you're looking at the leaders within the organization who are willing to put up their hands and become, those people who can set sort of the beachhead. How do you go about establishing a good culture of learning that can sort of adapt itself to being a continuous learning organization?
If I have an absolute answer to this, I'm going to be a millionaire, or billionaire actually, more so.
We have a disclaimer from you that it's your view. So.
Right. I think the starting point, and there are a couple of things. I mean, without even going into what Peter Senge once said about a learning organization and what makes it one. I think the key is to figure out how do you promote lifelong learning within your organization. How do you make sure that your practitioners or your employees are interested in constantly reflecting, constantly becoming better? And that's something that has to come from inside. I mean, no amount of policy, no amount of direction, no amount of messaging would effectively go ahead and do that. The starting point effectively would be, hiring the right people potentially. And I'm saying both from a point of view of, the learning organization as well as point of view of, people who are effectively in the business and in the employees. Taking away the barriers to learn, as organizations, one of my experience has been, across whatever number of years, is that we consciously create barriers for our learners. We don't really, I wish we were thinking of them the same way that marketers think about consumers. We don't. And I think it's potentially the direction that we should go. How do we go ahead and how do we take those barriers away? How do we make learning more democratic? How do we make them go ahead and interact with more people from outside of the organization? How do we get them to not learn what we want them to learn, but learn what they're interested in? Yeah. I think so that potentially may be one of the steps. And again, all of this needs to have a certain amount of leadership drive, not a certain amount, actually a lot of leadership drive. This is not something that is going to, in the traditional, and we, as HR professionals, we live in this self-imposed ROI prison. I think we need to get out of it. This is not something that is going to yield ROI in any measurable way. In the 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, this is a long haul exercise. And this needs to be, tackled that way. There needs to be stability at the organization side. There needs to be stability within the function for something like this to effectively go ahead and move forward.
Great. So empowering learners, giving them choice, not looking at ROI as much, absolutely critical.
Not driving
Not
with
driving
ROI as
through
the key
ROI
focus.
lens. Yes. Sorry,
Can I
Dhamyanthi.
add, Arun?
Yes, please.
So something which we tried recently for leadership, which had worked very well, I wanted to share with you. See, all of us know that people who are at the leadership level, vice presidents and above, and directors and above, they never find time to come to the classroom and attend any training. Okay, at the same time, it is important as a learning and development professional that we will have to teach them technology. Forget about leadership. Okay, so how do we do that? So this is what we were thinking about, and of late, people are also calling me, the leadership level people, they call me. Earlier, I used to get appointment, now they are getting appointment from me. The reason why they are saying is, tell me what do I need to learn? I have to thrive, not just survive. So I need your input. So these are all interesting, which shows that they are interested to learn. But how do they find time? That is where the challenge is. So we came up with something called 777. Okay, Lead by Experience is the name of the program. It had 7 modules, 7 hours, 7 weeks. Okay, that's all. Okay, every module is a technology module. It is about business analytics and then the business knowledge and the technology trends and all that. Apart from the communication and branding and change management and all that was also there. But all we told them is, it is going to be only 7 hours of learning over a period of 7 weeks, which is available in the form of 90 plus videos. Each video you can calculate. It will be like 2 minutes, 3 minutes videos. So, and we also created a WhatsApp group. We broken the team into 7 teams, and then we created a WhatsApp channel for them. And then we told them that you are going to compete with each other. All of you, you have to learn minimum every week 1 hour of learning. And additional learning, anything that you are learning, you will gain points. So it's a gamification. And then I was initially thinking it will be a flop because it's a leadership vice president who is going to compete. Imagine the way they are competing. They're saying, guys, our team is lagging. We'll have to go up. Please learn today this. And then we created some behaviors. We told them that all of you are at the leadership level, you will have some problem. So why don't you leverage the network for solving the problem? Post the problem, you will gain points. Answer the problem, you will get much more points. So imagine the way they were answering. And then we told, you have been learning a lot. Why don't you create a prototype and show it to your management, your reporting manager, and then get a feedback? Okay, that they were doing. So one emotional thing which has happened was, if I can take 1 more minute.
If it's brief, I think we're
Okay.
running out of time. Yes.
Okay, so there was one person who was diagnosed as cancer, and he knew that he is not going to live for many more months, but he joined this program, and he persuaded his manager to join the program. He created a prototype, and he showed it to his reporting manager and got a feedback. So this would have never happened because he was in US that time. This would have never happened if it was not a gamification and through a social media and connecting with people. Yeah. Just wanted to share
Thank
that.
you, Dhamayanthi. That was great. Live examples always help. So Selvan, coming back to you for a sum up. So in the world of hackathons, the world of empowering learners, the world of providing choice, the world of having a culture which is different, how should organizations think about learning differently? Should they go digital? Should they go self-paced? What are the old practices they should stop doing? And what are the new things that they should stop doing from the experience that you've had?
Sure. So I think as L&D, we also transformed to become digital age learning. So we set up a core team. We gave the leadership of that to a millennial. So that millennial directly reports to me. So we've given all the freedom. So a lot of change has been brought in by youngsters taking on leadership roles in learning and development and driving this change. But we cannot forget what we are doing in the conventional area, because I think the reality is 70% of our business is still in the traditional area at Capgemini, and about 30% is in the new age technologies, we would say. So we have clearly separated these two as 2 different teams, one calling themselves as an upskilling team, the other calling themselves as an emerging technologies team. And we are driving them separately, which is what pays off for us, because the needs seem to be quite different. Even the adaptation seems to be quite different. So we do a balance of both of these things, and it has paid off from the business point of view, is what I feel. Okay. So that's the sum of it. Okay. But rapidly moving towards digital age learning, driven by millennials who are leading that whole initiative.
Okay. And thank you, all of you on the panel. Wonderful, listening to your views and your experiences in terms of the recommendations you have for accelerating digital transformation. So as a closing note, we've been helping, as Pluralsight as a company has been helping organizations globally bridge their skill gaps, especially in the digital area, by a process of discovery and through personalized learning. So we've been making sure that the process of accelerating, the digital capability building, we played a fair part in that. So we're happy to talk to you offline. We have a stall outside, so do drop in whenever you have time. But thank you again to the panel for being here, for sharing your views. Lovely. Give them a big round of applause, please. Thank you so much.